people know who I am, and one Kevin Sullivan knows who I am. Look at me, Sullivan, because you're gonna be seeing a lot of me.
One of the saddest stories in wrestling has to be the early death of Buzz Sawyer. And the reason? Drugs. As tough as he was in the ring, he struggled with substance abuse, and it eventually took everything from him, even his life. He was just 32 when he died, gone way too soon. Just a brutal ending to a guy who had so much fight in him. Sawyer's career was anything but ordinary. It was a roller coaster of talent, controversy, and pure chaos. In the ring, he was as tough as they came, a hard-hitting competitor who could go toe-to-toe with the best in the business. His aggressive, no-nonsense style made him stand out, and his natural ability should have secured him a lasting legacy as one of wrestling's greats. But outside the ring, things were a completely different story. His battles weren't just against opponents in the squared circle, they were against himself. His struggles with drug addiction overshadowed everything else, creeping into his career and personal life until they completely took over. His behavior became unpredictable, his relationships suffered, and the talent that should have propelled him to the top became buried under the weight of his own self-destruction. Instead of being remembered solely for his wrestling skills and intensity, his name became a cautionary tale, one of wasted potential, bad decisions, and a tragic ending that came far too soon. Sawyer's drug abuse didn't just harm his health, it affected his behavior in every way. He became erratic and aggressive, making him a nightmare to deal with both professionally and personally. His outbursts weren't just something that happened in the ring, they followed him everywhere he went. Stories of him getting into altercations outside of wrestling events became more and more common, painting a picture of a man who was always on edge and ready for a fight. Whether it was at a bar, backstage, or even in the streets, his aggressive nature made him a magnet for trouble. His fiery temper led to countless fights and conflicts, and he often found himself in situations that went beyond just wrestling rivalries. Many wrestlers could be intense during matches, but for Buzz, the aggression didn't stop when the bell rang. He carried it with him in his personal life, making enemies both in and out of the business. His reputation for being unpredictable wasn't just something that added to his wrestling character. It was a real problem that affected his relationships, his career, and ultimately his future. As his drug use worsened, so did his behavior. He wasn't just a tough guy looking to prove himself anymore. He was a man losing control. The deeper he fell into substance abuse, the more reckless and unstable he became. It wasn't just about having a bad temper or getting into occasional fights. It became a pattern of self-destruction. And the problems didn't stop there. Behind the scenes, Sawyer had a reputation for being outright nasty. He was often described as a backstage bully, someone who thrived on stirring up trouble and making life miserable for those around him. Whether it was fellow wrestlers, staff, or even promoters, Sawyer had a way of creating tension wherever he went. The atmosphere around him was always uneasy. People didn't know what to expect, and at times it felt like anything could set him off. He wasn't just another loud personality in the locker room. He was a source of stress, frustration, and even fear for many who had to work with him. It wasn't just his words or attitude that made him difficult, it was the way he carried himself. He had no problem getting in people's faces, provoking fights, or making scenes that left everyone on edge. It didn't matter if it was before a match, after a match, or completely unrelated to wrestling. Sawyer seemed to always be at the center of chaos. Some wrestlers tried to avoid him, while others were forced to deal with his unpredictable nature. The more his problems with drugs grew, the worse his behavior became, making him a ticking time bomb in every locker room he stepped into. His reckless attitude didn't just stay behind the curtain either. When the bell rang, things could get even worse. Sawyer had a terrible habit of taking liberties in the ring, meaning he would go off script, hit harder than necessary, and sometimes outright hurt his opponents for real. Wrestling is built on trust between performers, but Buzz's reputation made that trust impossible. No one ever knew if he was going to follow the plan or if he was going to let his aggression take over and turn a match into something dangerous. Other wrestlers didn't trust him, and many downright hated working with him. For those who shared the ring with him, every match was a gamble. Some nights he would put on a great performance and stick to what was planned. Other nights, he would be completely out of control, turning what should have been a professional match into a real fight. He didn't seem to care if he was hurting his reputation or making enemies. He just kept going down the same reckless path. It was a recipe for disaster, and at the root of it all was his downward spiral with drugs. The deeper he fell into addiction, the more dangerous he became. And it wasn't long before his career and personal life started crumbling around him. But if you thought that was the worst of it, there was another side to his story that made his legacy even more infamous. One of the most unbelievable and damaging parts of Sawyer's reputation was how he treated aspiring wrestlers. Sawyer wasn't just difficult to work with, he had a reputation for being a full-on scam artist. While many wrestlers were known for having bad attitudes or being tough in the ring, Buzz took things to another level. He didn't just cause problems backstage or push people too hard in matches. He actively took advantage of others for his own personal gain. One of the worst things he became known for was scamming young, eager wrestlers who were desperate to learn the craft and break into the business. These hopeful trainees looked up to him, believing that learning from an experienced wrestler like Buzz could be their ticket to making it big. He saw their excitement, their passion, and most importantly, their willingness to pay for training. He would take their money, promising to teach them the ins and outs of professional wrestling, helping them develop the skills they needed to succeed. But instead of actually mentoring them, he would either mistreat them, abandon them, or simply take their money and disappear entirely. For many of these trainees, wrestling wasn't just a hobby, it was their dream. They were willing to do whatever it took to make it, and Buzz preyed on that dedication. Some of them put everything they had into paying for training, hoping it would lead to opportunities in the ring. But instead of guidance, they were met with disappointment. Some were subjected to brutal, unnecessary beatings under the guise of training, while others were completely ignored after handing over their cash. And in the worst cases, Buzz would simply skip town, leaving behind a trail of young wrestlers who had nothing to show for their time, effort, and money. It wasn't just a one-time thing either. This became a pattern for Buzz, something he did over and over again, conning hopeful trainees out of their hard-earned money without a second thought. Some of them tried to warn others, spreading the word about his scams, but there were always new wrestlers looking for a way into the business, young, eager, and unaware of the reputation Buzz had built for himself. By the time they realized they had been tricked, it was already too late. He didn't just take their money, he took their trust, their time, and in many cases, their belief in themselves. Some young wrestlers walked away from the industry entirely after being scammed by him, feeling discouraged and betrayed. Others tried to move forward, but the experience left a lasting impact. He had used their dreams as nothing more than a way to make a quick buck, caring little about the damage he left behind. It was yet another example of how his reckless, selfish behavior hurt not only his own career, but also the lives of those who once believed in him. And then it all came crashing down. After years of self-destruction, substance abuse finally took its toll. Sawyer was found dead at just 32 years old, a life cut tragically short by a drug overdose. His official cause of death was heart failure caused by a drug overdose. A tragic but, sadly, not surprising end for a man who had been on a downward spiral for years. His struggles with addiction had been obvious to those around him, and his reckless lifestyle had long hinted at an early demise. Friends, colleagues, and even fans had seen the warning signs: his erratic behavior, his violent outbursts, his declining health, but nothing ever changed. He kept pushing further and further down a dangerous path, and in the end, it caught up with him. Sawyer had lived fast and hard, but his body could only take so much abuse. The years of drug use, combined with the physical toll of professional wrestling, had worn him down. He was only 32 years old when he passed away. When the news of his death broke, few were truly shocked. Many who had worked with him over the years knew that if he didn't turn things around, something like this was inevitable. Some had tried to help him, others had given up on him, but in the end, nothing could stop the downward spiral. He had alienated so many people along the way that by the time he died, there weren't many left who still stood by him. His death was a sad reminder of the dangers of addiction and the consequences of a life lived recklessly. It's heartbreaking to think that he had the potential for a great career, but his struggles with substance abuse and ultimately his death cut it all short. Sawyer got his start in professional wrestling in 1978, though some sources claim it was 1979, when he debuted in Jim Crockett Promotions, an affiliate of the National Wrestling Alliance. Right from the beginning, it was clear that he wasn't like most wrestlers of the time. He had a raw, animalistic energy that made him stand out. He was intense, loud, and completely unpredictable, which made him both a crowd favorite and a nightmare for promoters trying to keep him in check. In those early years, he also wrestled in Georgia Championship Wrestling, where he spent most of his time until 1984. He often teamed up with his real-life brother, Brett Sawyer, but Buzz was never the type to settle for just being part of a tag team. He had a fire in him that led him into some of the most brutal rivalries of the era. One of the biggest feuds of his career was with the Road Warriors, and it all started when he walked away from their manager, Paul Ellering's Legion of Doom. The betrayal sparked a bitter rivalry, and if there was one thing Buzz Sawyer knew how to do, it was fight. During this time, he also crossed paths with Pez Whatley, a moment in wrestling history that some might overlook, but one that was important nonetheless. Whatley was the first wrestler to ever pin Sawyer on live television, marking a significant moment in Buzz's career. It showed that, while he was a dominant force, he wasn't unstoppable. But that didn't mean he wasn't dangerous, because the battles he fought in the ring were nothing short of brutal. Of all the feuds Sawyer had in his career, the one that truly defined him was his legendary rivalry with Tommy Rich. These two went at each other with a level of intensity rarely seen at the time. Their matches were bloodbaths, filled with chaos, violence, and raw emotion. It wasn't just about winning, it was personal. The hatred between them built up over time, leading to one of the most famous matches in wrestling history, the Last Battle of Atlanta. This match was unlike anything that had ever been done before. For the first time in professional wrestling, the cage surrounding the ring was completely enclosed, meaning there was no escape, no outside interference, and no way out until one man was completely beaten. It was a concept that was way ahead of its time, and years later, Shawn Michaels himself would credit this match as the inspiration for WWE's Hell in a Cell. To make things even more dramatic, Paul Ellering, Sawyer's former manager, was suspended 20 feet above the ring in a smaller cage to prevent him from interfering. The intensity was off the charts, and when it was all over, Tommy Rich walked away with the victory. The condition of the match stated that Sawyer and Rich would never wrestle each other again, bringing their brutal feud to an end. Decades later, on September 5th, 2016, WWE released the entire match on the WWE Network, allowing modern wrestling fans to witness a forgotten piece of history. In 1984, Sawyer made his way to the World Wrestling Federation, which at the time was becoming the biggest wrestling company in the world. However, his run there was short-lived. He was given the name Bulldog Buzz Sawyer since the moniker Mad Dog was already being used by Maurice Vachon. His gimmick fit his personality perfectly. He carried a dog chain, barked like a rabid animal, and even introduced a new finisher known as the Bulldog. Managed by the legendary captain Lou Albano, it seemed like he had the potential to make a big impact in the company. But in classic Buzz Sawyer fashion, things didn't go as planned, and he left shortly after arriving. After leaving the WWF, Sawyer returned to the NWA, this time working in championship wrestling from Florida. There he became part of Kevin Sullivan's stable and got involved in feuds with big names like Mike Graham, Dusty Rhodes, and Adrian Street. He played a crazed, unpredictable character, something that came naturally to him, but as was always the case, his time there didn't last too long before he moved on to another territory. In 1985, he joined Mid-South Wrestling and aligned himself with Dick Slater. When Slater won the North American title, he let Sawyer hold on to the Mid-South TV title for him. But things took a turn when the promotion tricked Slater into letting Sawyer defend the North American title, which he promptly lost. That's when the real chaos began. Sawyer refused to return the TV title to Slater, leading to yet another messy situation. By 1986, he was on the move again, this time heading to World Class Championship Wrestling, where he teamed up with Matt Bourne to win the WCWA Tag Team Championship. He also won the WCWA Television Championship and the WCWA Texas Heavyweight Championship, further adding to his collection of titles. But his time in WCCW ended in controversy. He got into a feud with Dingo Warrior and lost his tag team titles to him and Lance Von Erich, though he wasn't even in the match, with Master G substituting for him. Shortly after, he was reportedly fired for failing a drug test. In 1989, Buzz Sawyer returned to WCW as part of Gary Hart's J-Tex Corporation, which was feuding with the Four Horsemen. This put him in the ring with top stars like Arn Anderson, leading to some hard-hitting battles. But even as he remained relevant in wrestling, his personal issues continued to hold him back. By 1990, he joined Kevin Sullivan's Slaughterhouse stable and competed in Wrestle War 1990, where he teamed up with Sullivan to defeat the Dynamic Dudes. However, he fractured his wrist in the process, an injury that would further slow him down. By 1991, his wrestling career had all but faded. He was an undeniable talent, but his personal demons held him back at every turn. He could have been one of the biggest stars in wrestling history, but instead his reckless lifestyle and substance abuse problems led to an early exit from the business, and tragically, an early death at just 32 years old. His career will always be remembered for its wild nature, unpredictable moments, and the unforgettable battles he had in the ring. But perhaps more than anything, Buzz Sawyer's story is a reminder of how wasted potential and personal struggles can overshadow even the most promising careers. And that wraps up today's video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and subscribe.